The Great Depression is often remembered as a time of widespread suffering. Empty factories, endless bread lines, shuttered businesses, and families struggling to survive. It was a period that reshaped the nation, leaving few untouched by economic hardship. But for Black Americans, the Great Depression was not simply an economic collapse. It was a deepening of inequalities that had already shaped daily life for generations. Long before the stock market crashed in 1929, many Black families were living on the margins of American society. Their lives were defined by segregation, racial discrimination, and limited access to education, housing, and employment. Opportunities were scarce, wages were low, and legal systems often reinforced inequality rather than challenged it. So when the economy collapsed, Black communities were among the first to feel its impact. Jobs disappeared overnight. Wages were cut or eliminated entirely. Relief was often delayed or denied because of race. They were hit first, and they were often the last to recover. Yet this story is not only about suffering, it is also a story of endurance. Despite overwhelming obstacles, Black Americans found ways to survive. Families leaned on one another. Churches became lifelines. Communities organized, shared resources, and held fast to dignity in the face of hardship. This is the story of Black Americans during the Great Depression, a story of struggle, a story of resilience, and a story of enduring strength that would shape generations to come. Before the Great Depression, most Black Americans were already concentrated in low-wage, unstable forms of labor. Opportunities were limited not by ability, but by race. Many Black men and women worked in domestic service, employed as maids, cooks, nannies, and cleaners in white households. These jobs were physically demanding, offered little job security, and paid wages that barely covered daily necessities. In the rural South, millions of Black families worked as sharecroppers. They farmed land they did not own, borrowing seeds, tools, and supplies from landowners in exchange for a share of the harvest. This system trapped families in cycles of debt that were nearly impossible to escape, even in good years. Others found work on railroads and in factories, often doing the most dangerous and lowest-paid jobs. Even when Black workers had experience, they were frequently denied promotions or skilled positions. When the economy collapsed in the early 1930s, these fragile jobs disappeared almost overnight. Black unemployment rates soared, often reaching twice the rate of white workers. In many cities, employers openly practiced discrimination, firing Black workers first and refusing to rehire them when limited jobs returned. The phrase, "last hired, first fired," became a painful reality. In the South, falling crop prices devastated sharecropping families. Cotton, tobacco, and other staple crops lost much of their value. Families who had once scraped by now earned almost nothing at all. Yet landowners still demanded repayment of debts. Unable to pay, many families were evicted from the land they had worked for years. Hunger became widespread. Eviction notices piled up. Homelessness increased as families crowded into relatives' homes or built makeshift shelters. For many Black Americans, the Great Depression was not just a period of economic hardship. It was a daily fight for survival. And yet, even in these harsh conditions, families endured, adapted, and leaned on one another to survive what felt like an endless crisis. Jim Crow laws shaped nearly every aspect of life for Black Americans during the Great Depression, and relief efforts were no exception. Although poverty was widespread across the nation, access to aid was deeply unequal. Segregation ensured that many government and private relief programs either excluded Black Americans entirely or offered them far less assistance. In both the North and the South, local officials often controlled how aid was distributed, and many used that power to reinforce racial hierarchies. Labor unions, which could have offered protection and job security, frequently excluded Black workers. Without union membership, Black laborers had little bargaining power and few legal protections. Even when jobs were scarce, white workers were often given preference, even in cases where Black workers were more skilled, more experienced, or had held the position longer. In some cities, relief agencies made their policies unmistakably clear. Signs and statements openly declared, "White men first." These words were more than rhetoric. They determined who ate, who worked, and who went without. Black women faced especially harsh conditions. Many worked as maids, cooks, nannies, or laundresses, roles that were considered essential yet undervalued. During the Depression, their wages dropped drastically. Some employers no longer paid in cash at all, offering meals, leftover food, or clothing instead. Despite working long hours, many women struggled to feed their own families. Yet in the midst of exclusion and hardship, Black communities refused to face the crisis alone. Mutual aid became a cornerstone of survival. Churches pooled their limited resources, organizing food drives, clothing exchanges, and emergency assistance. Neighbors shared meals, stretching what little they had so no one would go hungry. Families took in relatives who had been evicted or displaced. Informal childcare networks emerged, allowing parents to seek work while others watched over the children. Elders passed down wisdom, encouragement, and faith during moments of deep uncertainty. Survival was not individual, it was collective. Through cooperation, solidarity, and resilience, Black communities created systems of care when official systems failed them. These networks not only sustained families during the Great Depression, but also laid the foundation for future organizing and resistance. In the face of discrimination, Black Americans built strength together, proving that even in the hardest times, community could be a powerful form of survival. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs brought much-needed relief to millions of Americans during the Great Depression, but they did not bring equality. For Black Americans, the New Deal was complex and contradictory. It offered assistance at a time of desperate need, yet it also reflected, and often reinforced, the racial discrimination deeply embedded in American society. Programs such as the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and other federal initiatives did employ Black workers. For many families, these jobs meant food on the table and a measure of stability. However, participation came with clear limitations. Jobs were often segregated, with Black workers assigned to the most physically demanding or least desirable tasks. Pay was frequently lower than that of white workers performing similar work. Leadership and supervisory roles were rarely offered to Black employees, even when they were qualified or experienced. In the South, discrimination was especially pronounced. Southern lawmakers and local officials were given significant control over how New Deal programs were implemented. They used this power to ensure that Jim Crow segregation remained intact. As a result, many Black Americans were excluded from key benefits. Agricultural and domestic workers, jobs held disproportionately by Black men and women, were left out of major programs such as Social Security and unemployment insurance. These exclusions had long-term consequences, widening racial wealth gaps that would persist for generations. Yet despite these injustices, the New Deal marked an important shift. For the first time, many Black Americans began to see the federal government as a potential, though deeply flawed, source of support rather than solely a force of neglect or oppression. This shift altered political expectations and sparked new forms of advocacy. Organizations like the NAACP actively challenged discrimination within New Deal programs. They filed complaints, lobbied federal officials, and pressured the government to enforce fairer treatment. Black newspapers amplified these efforts, exposing unequal practices and demanding accountability. While the New Deal did not dismantle racial inequality, it reshaped the relationship between Black Americans and the federal government. It planted the idea that government could and should be challenged to live up to its promises. That belief would later fuel the civil rights struggles of the mid-20th century. In this way, the New Deal became both a symbol of relief and a reminder of unfinished justice, offering aid in the present while highlighting the work still left to be done. As rural life became increasingly unsustainable during the Great Depression, many Black families made the difficult decision to leave the land behind. This movement was not new. It was a continuation of the Great Migration, which had begun years earlier. But the economic collapse accelerated it dramatically. Families moved north and west in search of survival and possibility. They hoped to find factory work, even if the jobs were dangerous or low-paying. They sought greater safety from racial violence, lynching, and the rigid enforcement of Jim Crow laws in the South. And above all, they searched for better opportunities for their children, access to education, steady income, and a future less constrained by segregation. Trains, buses, and overcrowded automobiles carried families into cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Los Angeles, and Oakland. But the promise of the city was far from guaranteed. Urban areas were already strained by unemployment and poverty. Housing was scarce, and discrimination was widespread. Through restrictive covenants, redlining, and outright refusal to rent to Black tenants, many families were forced into overcrowded neighborhoods with inflated rents and deteriorating conditions. Landlords often charged Black tenants more for smaller, poorly maintained apartments. Entire families crowded into single rooms. Basic services, heat, sanitation, and repairs were frequently neglected. Faced with these realities, families adapted in powerful ways. Multiple generations lived together under one roof, pooling income and sharing responsibilities. Grandparents helped raise children. Extended family networks became a source of stability in an uncertain world. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers, taking jobs in domestic service, factories, kitchens, and laundry work to help support their households. Their labor became essential to family survival, even as it was undervalued and underpaid. Children, too, were affected. Many worked after school or left school entirely to help provide for their families. Newspapers sold on street corners. Shoes were shined. Small jobs became lifelines. Despite these hardships, Black families held fast to their values. Education was emphasized, even when attendance was interrupted. Faith remained central, with churches serving as places of worship, support, and organization. And dignity was fiercely protected, expressed through discipline, self-respect, and hope for the future. Migration during the Great Depression was not just a movement of people. It was a movement of resilience. Through adaptation, sacrifice, and determination, Black families carved out lives in unfamiliar cities, laying foundations that would shape urban Black communities for generations to come. Even in poverty, Black culture did not disappear. It endured, it adapted, and in many ways, it flourished. During the Great Depression, music, literature, and art became more than creative expression. They became tools of survival, testimony, and quiet resistance. When economic systems failed and social institutions excluded Black Americans, culture offered a voice. the blues carried the weight of daily struggle. Rooted in the lived experiences of working-class Black communities, blues music spoke plainly about hunger, joblessness, heartbreak, and injustice. There was no need for polish or pretense, only truth. At the same time, gospel music filled churches and homes with hope. Songs of faith reminded listeners that suffering was not the end of the story. Gospel offered reassurance that hardship could be endured and that God had not abandoned his people. Together, blues and gospel formed a powerful emotional language, one grounded in pain, yet reaching toward resilience. Lyrics told stories of empty pockets and broken promises. They spoke of long days of labor, of prayers whispered at night, and of hope held on to even when circumstances offered little reason for it. Music became both a release and a lifeline. Literature played a similar role. Writers and poets documented the emotional reality of the era, refusing to soften the truth or remain silent. Through essays, poems, and short stories, they gave voice to lives often ignored by mainstream narratives. Figures like Langston Hughes captured the spirit of the time with clarity and courage. His work reflected the frustrations, dreams, and quiet determination of Black Americans living through economic collapse. Rather than turning away from suffering, he insisted on naming it, while also affirming dignity and humanity. Visual artists, too, contributed to this cultural expression. Murals, paintings, and photographs depicted working-class life, migration, and community strength. Art made visible what society tried to overlook. In a world that often reduced Black Americans to statistics or stereotypes, culture declared presence. Art became a way to say, we are still here, we are still creating, we are still human, we are still worthy of being seen and heard. During the Great Depression, Black culture was not a luxury, it was a necessity. It sustained identity, preserved memory, and laid emotional groundwork for the struggles and movements that would follow. In the midst of hardship, culture kept hope alive. The Great Depression exposed America's racial inequalities with painful clarity, but it also reshaped Black political and social consciousness in lasting ways. For many Black Americans, the crisis revealed the limits of existing systems and the urgency of collective action. Economic collapse made inequality impossible to ignore. Discrimination in jobs, housing, and relief programs sharpened awareness of how deeply race shaped opportunity in the United States. During this period, many Black Americans began to shift their political allegiance, reassessing which institutions and leaders, if any, could be challenged to meet their needs. For the first time, significant numbers looked to the federal government not as a distant force, but as one that could be pressured, critiqued, and held accountable. Community organizations strengthened in response to exclusion. Churches, mutual aid societies, labor groups, and civil rights organizations expanded their roles. They provided not only material support, but also political education, leadership development, and a shared sense of purpose. Civil rights activism gained new momentum during these years. Legal challenges, public protest, and grassroots organizing increased, laying intellectual and organizational foundations for the movements that would follow in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. The hardships of the Depression taught painful lessons, but they also forged strategies for resistance and survival. The resilience built during the Great Depression did not disappear when the economy slowly recovered. It carried forward into future struggles for voting rights, fair employment, housing, and equality under the law. Despite systemic barriers, Black Americans endured. They endured through cooperation, leaning on one another when institutions failed, through creativity, using art, music, and literature to preserve dignity and voice, through faith, finding strength and meaning in spiritual life, and through determination, refusing to surrender hope even when circumstances were unforgiving. Their story during the Great Depression is not only a story of hardship, it is a story of strength that refused to disappear. A story of people who survived not because conditions were fair, but because resilience was woven into community, culture, and conviction. That legacy continues to shape American history today. If you found this history meaningful, if it offered you a deeper understanding of the past, or helped illuminate stories that are too often overlooked or left untold, consider subscribing for more educational documentaries and untold stories from American history. This channel is dedicated to exploring history with honesty, context, and care, not just the major events recorded in textbooks, but the lived experiences of ordinary people, their struggles, their choices, and their resilience in the face of hardship. We believe history is more than dates and statistics. It is made up of voices, families, communities, and moments of courage that continue to shape the world we live in today. By subscribing, you help keep these stories alive. You help ensure that the experiences, struggles, and contributions of those who came before us are remembered, respected, and shared. You help create space for history that acknowledges truth, complexity, and humanity. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Thank you for engaging thoughtfully with the past. And thank you for honoring the voices and lives that helped shape this nation through perseverance and strength. History does not end when the video does. Its lessons continue in our conversations, in our communities, and in the way we choose to understand one another. Until next time.